A family from the south who suffered years of racist abuse from their neighbours say they feel let down by the British justice system. At one point, the family slept with a bucket of water by their bed after their neighbours threatened to set fire to their home. They say the way their case was handled and the lenient punishments that were issued only made their situation worse. This special report from MyCaps uses actors and animation to protect the identities of the family involved.
And they started yelling at us again. Go on, run off, run inside, go into your curry house.
I had a bucket ready to fill up with water if need be, because I was worried that these people were going to set fire to us while we're in our house. When they were hailing abuse, they shouted, "We'll get you, we'll burn you up in your house."
The family's problems started back in 2017 when they'd returned home from a shopping trip.
Totally out of the blue, we pulled up outside our house, started ushering the children inside. I heard someone shout, "Weirdo." I turned round and looked, and there was this chap, one of our neighbours, standing opposite, just shouting, hailing abuse at us. And then they came closer and closer. They teamed up and shouted more racial abuse.
And the remarks that were coming out of their mouths were disgusting. It was mostly racial, aimed at my husband, because obviously that's what their issue is. And they wanted to fight with you, coming across, offering him out.
Come on, you black.
I phoned the police straight away, to which I was told they didn't need to come out because they wasn't still doing it.
The police did eventually take action, but only after the family had made statements. Both neighbours pleaded guilty in court to a racial public order offence. They were each issued with a £200 fine, a £30 surcharge and other fines. But the families say they were told their neighbours didn't have to pay the vast majority of their fines because they were on benefits. Despite being told they'd be able to provide evidence from behind a screen or via video link, the families say that on the day of one of the hearings, they were told they'd have to testify in court in front of their neighbours. They say this only changed because one of the neighbours changed their plea to guilty at the last moment.
There was no, if you do this again, there was nothing. You pay a fine and you walk out of court free.
We wasn't informed of the outcome. She was talking to one of the neighbours on the other side, her friend, and made it clear with a piece of paper in her hand, waving it. It only cost me 30 quid to call him a black and grinning and laughing at us.
But the police officer said, "Oh, it's a good outcome because she's been convicted." But I said for them to get a criminal record is like giving them a gold star and saying, "Well done," and a pat on the back.
An officer from the Housing Association was so concerned about the family's safety after their neighbours made a threat of violence towards them to him that they launched a civil court case. This resulted in a restraining order being issued, which gave the police powers of arrest against the neighbours if evidence could be provided of further incidents. The families say all this did was lead to an escalation of their problems. Over the years that followed, they told me a racist term was written in graffiti in the road outside their house, which they reported to the police. Broken glass was scattered across their front garden where their children played. And they claim they came home one day to find that their dogs had died after bags containing a poisonous substance were thrown into their back garden. They didn't report these incidents to the police because they say they weren't confident they'd be acted on. The powers of arrest were never used.
I've had both parties turn up at work and just look at me and laugh and, you know, grin.
Our children refuse to play out because they stand and stare at our children when they're outside playing, and they make them feel uncomfortable.
Their friends come past and it's like doing a drive-by. They'll speed up. As soon as they get to my house, slow down, rev the engine, stare at us, and then they zoom off.
It made me sick. I was going to counselling. I was taking medication from the doctors. I wasn't sleeping.
The only time it's really affected me, I was in the bath, just laying in the bath, and my son was there, playing with the bubbles in my bath, and he said, "Dad, why don't we get that paint that's left over from the house and we just paint me, you and his older brother? We paint ourselves all white and then we don't have any problems." And that's the time I can honestly say in my life that it's actually brought tears to my eyes.
In 2019, I contacted the family's housing association, Sovereign Housing, who manage properties across the south, to highlight their case. It proved to be a complicated journey to get them moved to a new home, but after more than a year, they were finally relocated, which has come as a huge relief to them. But they still feel anger towards a justice system which they say has left them with no option but to walk away from their jobs and their friends because of the way it deals with racially aggravated crime.
I believe the CPS has let us down, and I believe they're probably letting a lot of other people down in the same situation.
I think it's ridiculous. And I personally believe that if it was the other way around, that it would be a completely different story. That if it was my husband causing the issues racially to them people, it would be a completely different story.
And Mike is in the studio with me now. Mike, the family's account of what they went through is truly shocking.
Yes, and I'm glad to say that they don't have to live like this anymore, thanks to Sovereign Housing moving them to a new home. But they've been left with a number of unanswered questions. Chiefly, why wasn't stronger and more decisive action taken by the authorities to deal with their neighbours?
And what more have you been able to find out?
Well, I've spoken to the police force who answered the original 999 call and subsequent calls. Now, they say that, well, we're not naming them, I should say, because we're protecting the family's anonymity. They told me that we know that hate crimes have a disproportionate impact on victims, their families and the wider community. We take all reports of hate crime very seriously. Now, I asked the housing association, Sovereign Housing, if they had explored the option of evicting the neighbours if they'd been found to be in breach of their tenancy, and if so, why this hadn't happened, but they've declined to comment.
And what about how the case was handled by the courts, Mike?
Well, I spoke to the Crown Prosecution Service. Now, they said it wasn't necessary to offer the family the option of speaking from behind a screen because ultimately both neighbours pleaded guilty, which is true, but they haven't answered the claim by the family that this was only the result of a last-minute change of plea by the neighbours. Now, on to the question of the severity of the sentences which were handed down. They say the CPS cannot decide what sentence a defendant must face. That is a matter for the court. The CPS asked the court for sentence uplifts in this case, and the court decided to give both defendants an increased fine to reflect the racially aggravated element. So it begs the question, should prosecutors be able to call for harsher penalties in racially aggravated cases? I put that question to the Ministry of Justice, but it hasn't responded to that.
Mike, thank you very much indeed. Mike Apps there. Well, earlier I spoke to Don John, who's a race and diversity consultant in Southampton, and I started by asking him for his reaction to the experience of this family.
It's not uncommon, put it that way. I used to work in the housing department over 20 years ago, and these cases were happening on a regular basis. It's so sad to see that it's still going on now.
You've worked with people across Southampton who have housing issues. Why was it, do you think, in this case, that it was the family, the victims here, who had to move rather than the neighbours?
Well, that's been a bone of contention for many years. It seems as if landlords find it far easier to move the complainant. And I think sometimes that's because they fear that if they move the perpetrators, they'll lose the trust of the local white communities. And I guess they're a little bit cowardly in not wanting to pursue that.
Now, Don, we've seen the Black Lives Matter movement grow across the globe recently, haven't we? Do you have a sense of hope that things will change?
Well, there's a lot of conversation, but very little action. And even though Black Lives Matter took place a year and a half ago or so, it seems to me that the rhetoric and the discussion is far more substantial than the actions that people are taking. There's been lots of kind of yes, we will do this, we'll have anti-harassment policies, but the reality is that there's very little on the ground to give us hope.
Now, this story raises big questions about big institutions in this country. What do you think needs to change?
Well, I think the first thing that needs to change is that the two main organisations that can deal with this, firstly the police services, need to make themselves a little bit more accommodating, at least let black communities and people who've been harassed, let them know they're on their side. At the moment, as far as those people are concerned, they don't feel the police services and the criminal justice system are on their side. And secondly, the housing organisations need to be a bit more robust in actually dealing with perpetrators. Bad tenants have got to be removed because they make life difficult for so many good tenants. And I guess the law needs to change, and housing associations and other landlords need to kind of do something a little bit more to protect the lives and the welfare of people who've been harassed and attacked.
John, really good to talk to you this evening. Thanks very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
And if you've been the victim of racism, there is a list of organisations that may be able to help you via the BBC's Action Line. The telephone number 0800 066 066 or bbc.co.uk/action line on the internet.